Most people are chasing money without realizing they are running from fear. Fear of being left behind, fear of not having enough, fear of tomorrow. And what if I told you that one chapter of the Quran directly confronts that fear, dismantles it piece by piece, and replaces it with an unshakable certainty that Shaytan desperately wants to keep away from you? There is a reason this surah makes people uncomfortable, a reason it shakes the heart instead of soothing it, and a reason it has been whispered about for generations as a chapter that changes how a believer understands provision itself. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments, what country are you watching from right now? And if reminders like this strengthen your iman and reconnect you with the Quran, make sure you subscribe so you never miss what truly benefits the heart. Surah Al-Waqiah is often recited softly, almost routinely, but very few people stop to ask what it is actually doing to the soul that listens to it with awareness. It is not a surah of comfort in the way people expect comfort to feel. It does not flatter human ambition or promise effortless success. Instead, it grabs the heart and forces it to look directly at reality, the reality of the hereafter, the fragility of this world, and the illusion of control that human beings cling to every single day. Many people say they recite it for rizq, but they do not realize that before Allah changes what is in their hands, He changes what is in their hearts. This surah quietly rewires how a believer understands wealth, loss, security, and success. It pulls the soul away from panic and desperation and anchors it in certainty, and that certainty is something Shaytan cannot survive around. Shaytan's entire strategy is built on keeping the human heart distracted, doubtful, and afraid. He does not need to stop you from praying altogether if he can hollow out your trust in Allah. And this is why the Quran itself is described in authentic hadith as something he actively flees from. The Prophet ﷺ taught that Shaytan runs from a house in which the Quran is recited because divine speech is not neutral sound, it is light, and darkness cannot coexist with it. Surah Al-Waqiah is especially heavy with meanings that destroy Shaytan's favorite tools. It strips away the illusion that the future is guaranteed. It demolishes the lie that wealth equals security. It exposes the weakness of human power and replaces it with the absolute authority of Allah. When these meanings settle into the heart, Shaytan loses leverage. Fear of poverty weakens. Anxiety about provision begins to dissolve. Greed no longer feels urgent. This is not because the surah magically produces money, but because it produces yaqeen, certainty, and certainty transforms behavior, choices, patience, and dua. A heart grounded in certainty becomes resistant to whispers that say, "What if you don't have enough?" Or, "What if Allah does not provide for you?" Because Allah Himself has already answered those doubts within His book. The very name of the surah tells you that this is not a gentle reminder meant to pass unnoticed, is less than #0. 5# is greater than Al-Waqiah means the inevitable, the event that cannot be delayed, negotiated, or escaped. From the opening verses, Allah does not invite debate or speculation. He declares that what is coming is real, that it will arrive suddenly, and that when it does, the world as people know it will be turned upside down. Mountains, symbols of permanence and strength, will be scattered like dust. Social hierarchies, wealth and status will collapse in a single moment. Human beings live as if tomorrow belongs to them, as if income streams are permanent, as if plans are guaranteed to succeed. Surah Al-Waqiah violently interrupts that mindset. It forces the listener to confront a truth that Shaytan works tirelessly to suppress, that this life is temporary, unstable, and not the place of ultimate reward or punishment. And once that truth settles in the heart, something remarkable happens. The believer stops clinging to the dunya with desperation and starts engaging with it responsibly, ethically, and with trust in Allah rather than obsession. This shift is the beginning of true freedom, the kind of freedom that allows rizq to arrive with barakah and depart without breaking the soul. When Surah Al-Waqiah begins to describe humanity being divided into three groups, it does something deeply unsettling to the ego. It removes every excuse people use to feel safe without accountability. Allah does not divide people by how famous they were, how much they earned, or how respected they appeared in the world. He divides them by reality, not reputation. The foremost, the people of the right, and the people of the left, three categories that quietly contain every human being who has ever lived. There is no fourth group, no hidden exemption, no special category for intentions without action or beliefs without obedience. The foremost are described first, not because they are many, but because they are rare. These are people who raced toward Allah when others hesitated, who obeyed when obedience was costly, and who trusted Allah when trust felt dangerous. They are not defined by comfort, but by sacrifice, and Allah honors them with nearness that no worldly achievement can match. Then come the people of the right, believers who held on to faith, struggled, repented, fell and rose again, but ultimately chose Allah over their desires. And finally, the people of the left, those who dismissed reminders, mocked accountability, and lived as though this world was all there was. The brilliance of this passage is that it forces the listener to stop spectating and start self-examining. You are no longer reading about people. You are being asked, silently but firmly, where you will stand when the inevitable arrives. Shaytan hates this moment of reflection because once a person begins to measure their life against the hereafter, empty distractions lose their appeal. Goals change. Priorities reorder themselves. And most importantly, the frantic chase for provision begins to slow because the believer realizes that success is not defined by how much they accumulate, but by where they end up. As the surah continues, Allah redirects the listener's attention away from people entirely and toward Himself as the sole source of provision. This is where Surah Al-Waqiah dismantles one of the deepest anxieties in the human heart, the fear that sustenance is unstable, competitive, or dependent on forces outside Allah's control. Allah reminds humanity that every form of rizq, they rely on food, water, energy, even life itself exists only because He wills it to exist. Crops do not grow because farmers are skilled. Rain does not fall because clouds decide to cooperate. Seeds do not sprout because effort alone deserves reward. Allah asks directly, almost challengingly, "Is it you who causes it to grow, or are we the one who causes it to grow?" This question is not rhetorical decoration. It is meant to corner the human mind into honesty. If Allah willed, the harvest could turn to dust overnight. If Allah willed, the water people depend on could become bitter and undrinkable. These are not threats. They are reminders of dependence. When a believer truly absorbs this, something profound happens inside them. The heart stops panicking over numbers, projections, and worst-case scenarios. Effort continues, but desperation disappears. Work becomes an act of worship rather than a source of identity. Shaytan thrives on convincing people that provision comes from people, systems, employers, or luck. Surah Al-Waqiah crushes that lie and replaces it with a truth that stabilizes the soul. Your rizq was written before you were born, and nothing meant for you will ever miss you. Allah then confronts one of the most dangerous illusions humans live under, the illusion of control. People speak confidently about my income, my skills, my future, and my plans, as though outcomes obey human will. Surah Al-Waqiah peels back that arrogance layer by layer. It reminds the listener that even the most basic processes of life operate entirely beyond human authority. You may plant a seed, but you cannot command it to live. You may drink water, but you did not create its purity. You may light a fire, but you did not invent the energy hidden within what burns. Allah states clearly that He is the one who made fire a reminder and a provision, a tool that benefits humanity only because He allows it to. These verses are deeply humbling, and humility is something Shaytan cannot tolerate. Arrogance is his oxygen. The moment a person recognizes their fragility and Allah's absolute control, Shaytan's whispers weaken. Fear loses its grip, because fear is born from the illusion that everything rests on human effort alone. Surah Al-Waqiah does not call believers to abandon effort, it calls them to abandon arrogance. When control is returned to Allah in the heart, the believer gains something far more valuable than financial security. They gain inner stability. And that stability changes how trials are faced, how loss is processed, and how blessings are received. A person who knows Allah is in control does not collapse when provision tightens, nor do they become arrogant when it expands. They remain grounded, patient, grateful, and focused. This balanced heart is exactly what Allah loves and supports, and it is exactly the kind of heart that Shaytan fears most. One of the most dangerous misconceptions Shaytan plants in the human mind is that remembrance of Allah is optional, something to return to only in moments of crisis. The Quran, however, exposes remembrance as a form of spiritual protection, a shield that weakens Shaytan's influence over the heart. Authentic hadith clearly state that Shaytan withdraws and recoils when Allah is remembered, because remembrance brings light, and Shaytan thrives only in darkness. Surah Al-Waqiah is saturated with meanings that force the heart into remembrance, whether it wants to or not. Every verse pulls the listener away from distraction and back to ultimate realities: death, resurrection, judgment, and divine power. Shaytan does not fear long to-do lists or ambitious goals, but he fears a heart that constantly remembers where it is going. When Surah Al-Waqiah is recited with awareness, it breaks the cycle of heedlessness that keeps people spiritually asleep while physically active. It interrupts the endless noise of worldly concern and replaces it with sober clarity. This clarity is uncomfortable at first, because it demands honesty, but it is also liberating. A heart grounded in remembrance is far less reactive to fear-based whispers about money, status, and future uncertainty. Instead of spiraling into anxiety, the believer begins to ask better questions. Am I living for what ends, or for what lasts? Is less than #0. 5# is greater than Shaytan loses power when those questions take root, because manipulation depends on short-term thinking, not eternal awareness. As the surah continues to unfold its message, it begins to quietly reprogram the believer's relationship with the dunya itself. The world is no longer presented as evil or meaningless, but as temporary, unstable, and unworthy of ultimate attachment. Surah Al-Waqiah exposes the dunya for what it truly is, a testing ground, not a destination. People often assume that contentment will arrive once they reach a certain level of comfort or financial stability, yet experience proves the opposite. The more tightly someone clings to dunya, the more anxious they become about losing it. This surah gently but firmly loosens that grip. By reminding the listener of the hereafter's permanence and the dunya's fragility, it reorders desire itself. Wealth stops being a source of identity and becomes a trust. Hardship stops being proof of failure and becomes a test of patience. The Prophet ﷺ taught in authentic hadith that true richness is not having many possessions, but having a soul that is content. Surah Al-Waqiah cultivates that richness by stripping away false expectations. When a believer internalizes its message, they stop measuring success by comparison and start measuring it by obedience. This shift changes how effort feels. Work becomes sincere rather than desperate. Dua becomes trusting rather than transactional. Barakah enters places where panic once lived. Shaytan despises this transformation because a believer who is no longer obsessed with dunya cannot be controlled through fear of losing it. There is also something uniquely powerful about engaging with this surah during moments of quiet, especially at night, when distractions fade and the heart is more exposed. The Prophet ﷺ consistently stood in prayer at night, reciting the Quran slowly and reflectively, not rushing through words but allowing meanings to settle. Nighttime recitation strips away performance and habit, leaving only sincerity. Surah Al-Waqiah, when recited in these moments, becomes deeply personal. Its verses feel less like distant descriptions and more like direct conversations with the soul. The reminders of death become intimate rather than abstract. The questions Allah poses about provision, control, and dependence feel impossible to ignore. Shaytan struggles most when a believer is alone with Allah, undistracted, honest, and reflective. In those moments, the heart is not defending itself with noise or busyness. It listens. And when the heart listens, it begins to heal. Anxiety that once felt permanent begins to loosen. Fear of the future softens into trust. Even when material circumstances remain unchanged, the believer feels lighter, steadier, and more focused. This is the quiet power of Surah Al-Waqiah, not dramatic, not instant, but deeply transformative. It does not promise ease without effort, but it promises clarity without illusion. And a heart armed with clarity is one Shaytan finds extremely difficult to mislead. One of the clearest battles described in the Quran is the battle over fear, specifically, fear of poverty. Allah openly exposes Shaytan's strategy when he says that Shaytan threatens you with poverty and commands you to immorality, while Allah promises you forgiveness and bounty from him. This is not a metaphor, it is a description of a psychological and spiritual war that plays out daily in the human heart. Fear of not having enough drives people to compromise their values, rush decisions, exhaust themselves, and sometimes even disobey Allah in the name of survival. Surah Al-Waqiah directly confronts this fear by shifting the believer's focus away from outcomes and back to the one who controls them. When the heart truly absorbs that Allah alone is our Razak, fear begins to lose its authority. Provision is no longer something hunted anxiously, it becomes something received with trust. This does not mean effort stops, it means panic stops. The believer still works, plans, and strives, but without the desperation that corrodes the soul. Shaytan relies on urgency and pressure, whispering that time is running out, that others are ahead, that failure is imminent. Surah Al-Waqiah dissolves that urgency by reminding the listener that nothing arrives early or late outside Allah's decree. What is written will come, and what is not written will never arrive, no matter how hard one chases it. This realization produces a calm strength that Shaytan cannot penetrate. Fear is replaced with patience, envy with contentment, and anxiety with dua. The believer stops measuring life by what is missing and starts recognizing what has already been provided. This is the moment when rizq begins to feel sufficient, even before it increases, because the heart is no longer at war with itself. Surah Al-Waqiah then takes the listener to the most sobering reality of all, the moment of death. Not death as an abstract concept, but death as an unavoidable, intimate experience that every soul will face alone. Allah describes the final moments when the soul reaches the throat, when loved ones can do nothing, when power, wealth, and status evaporate instantly. This passage is intentionally uncomfortable, because comfort breeds forgetfulness. Shaytan's greatest success is convincing people that death is distant, negotiable, or irrelevant to daily choices. Surah Al-Waqiah destroys that illusion completely. It forces the listener to confront a simple but devastating truth. When that moment arrives, nothing you owned will follow you, and nothing you delayed will be excused. Yet this reminder is not meant to paralyze the believer with fear. It is meant to awaken them. A person who remembers death regularly does not live recklessly. They live intentionally. They become careful with their prayers, cautious with their income, gentle with people, and sincere in repentance. The Prophet ﷺ praised those who remember death often because it cuts attachment to dunya and sharpens focus on what truly matters. Surah Al-Waqiah does exactly that. It pulls the future into the present so that today is lived correctly. When death becomes real, procrastination loses its charm. Arrogance softens. Forgiveness becomes easier. And obedience stops feeling optional. Shaytan fears a believer who lives with death in mind, because such a believer cannot be easily distracted, delayed, or deceived. Their life becomes purposeful, their worship becomes focused, and their reliance on Allah becomes sincere rather than theoretical. In the end, Surah Al-Waqiah reveals a truth that many overlook. The unlocking of Rizq is not a formula, a ritual, or a transaction. It is a transformation. This surah does not promise wealth to those who merely recite it. It reshapes the worldview of those who reflect upon it. When the hereafter becomes certain, dunya takes its proper size. When Allah becomes central, everything else finds its place. The believer who lives by the message of this surah is no longer controlled by fear of loss or obsession with gain. They give without panic, withhold without guilt, and trust without hesitation. This inner alignment is what invites barakah. Not because Allah is obligated, but because Allah loves hearts that rely on Him fully. Shaytan despises Surah Al-Waqiah because it produces believers who cannot be manipulated by scarcity, intimidated by hardship, or corrupted by excess. It produces servants who know that provision is a means, not a purpose, and that success is measured by acceptance, not accumulation. When this understanding settles into the heart, life changes, even if circumstances do not immediately do so. Peace replaces restlessness. Trust replaces fear. And the believer walks through dunya anchored, dignified, and unafraid, knowing with certainty that what Allah has prepared is far greater than anything this world could ever offer.